This is Damon Fordham, adjunct professor of history at the Citadel. And this morning I'd like to share with you a story from my book, The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, about an important work of prophecy. You see, you had what was called the Reconstruction era, which was that brief period from about 1865 on up to the late 1800s, where you had a numerous Black representation and Black voting in the South before bigoted leaders such as Benjamin Tillman here in South Carolina, as well as James K. Vardaman in Mississippi, Hoke Smith in Georgia, and numerous other type of leaders, erased African Americans' right to vote and brought in the segregation era. Part of that was so to ensure that Black people would be a permanent class of cheap labor for the South, as well as dividing and conquering the poor whites and the poor Blacks of the South, so that the class of people that Benjamin Tillman and James K. Vardaman belonged to could stay rich. Well, the last Black representative out of North Carolina during the Reconstruction era was this fellow by the name of George Henry White. That's him who I'm pointing to right here. He served as a representative from North Carolina in Congress up until 1901, shortly after the Jim Crow laws were passed. And he got up during his last session and gave this great inspiring speech on his farewell from Congress, where he said these words: "This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say this phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again. These parting words on behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised, and bleeding, but God-fearing people, faithful, industrious, loyal people, rising people full of potential force." Deep, huh? In the midst of all that despair, this is 3 years after the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, 5 years after Plessy versus Ferguson said that segregation was legal, and yet he had the hope to say something like this, that even though they were being taken out of political office all over the place, that they would someday come back and rise again. Well, people probably hearing at that time said, man, he's just saying that to make us feel better. That's not going to happen. Well, guess what? In 1928, there was a gentleman out of Chicago named Oscar DePriest, who became the first Black congressman since the end of Reconstruction, since Black people could vote in Chicago. And not only was he the first Black congressman, guess what? There were two Reconstruction politicians at that time who were still alive: Thomas Miller from South Carolina and John Roy Lynch out of Mississippi. And early in 1930, this same Oscar DePriest invited John Lynch and Thomas Miller to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., and he introduced them to let them know that he was not alone in history as being an African American in Congress, and the audience applauded them. And not only did Oscar DePriest fulfill the prophecy of George Henry White, Thomas Miller and John Roy Lynch lived to see themselves come back into Congress and to be welcomed in that fashion years after men like them were forced to resign from office. Ladies and gentlemen, the message of this story is quite simple. Where there is hope, there is life. And without hope, you die. And in order to accomplish anything in life, you got to have hope that that's possible. Because if you don't, nothing will be accomplished. This is Damon Fordham.